Hello, my name is Michael Carey and I will be discussing how the prescription drug companies are responsible for the opiate crisis that we now see in America. Due to marketing and lobbying tactics used by these large pharmaceutical companies, the United States is in an opioid crisis of epidemic proportions. In order to accurately discuss the nature of the opiate crisis and its potential causes, and understanding what addiction is must first be understood. According to the American Psychiatric Association, addiction is defined as a compulsive brain disorder which compels an individual to continue to use substances despite potential or actualized negative consequences. The reasons that an individual may become addicted to substances or display addictive tendencies are threefold and include behavioral factors, environmental factors, and biological factors. The National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse states that genetics plays a large role in determining who will deal with addictive tendencies, and like other diseases, addiction is primarily a hereditary disease. So what is the opiate crisis exactly? Well, in the latter half of the 20th century, Purdue Pharmaceuticals introduced what was known as OxyContin to the market. It was touted as a miracle drug to help treat those dealing with chronic, severe pain. OxyContin is in the class of drug known as opioids that act on neurotransmitters in the brain and release large amounts of dopamine. This dopamine causes a feeling of euphoria and confidence in the user, and over time their dependence to this substance grows and the brain stops producing natural dopamine, requiring more and more of the drug to get the same effect. Some examples of common opioids in the market today are oxycodone, morphine, hydrocodone, heroin, and fentanyl. Over the years, oxycodone has continued to be used to treat moderate to severe pain, while the death rates have steadily increased as more and more individuals continue to use the drug. Currently, about 30% of prescription opiate users will abuse them, and in 2016, the Center for Disease and Control estimated that there were 42,000 deaths attributed to opiate overdoses, which is more than gun violence and car accidents. Much has been made in the media about marijuana and other substances being classified as gateway drugs leading to harder substances. However, statistics show that prescription opiates are the true gateway drug in this country, oftentimes leading to fentanyl usage and heroin usage, which have a higher mortality rate. So is the opiate epidemic actually going on, or is it an overblown media portrayal? Well, at the height of, everybody can understand the crack epidemic that was occurring in the 1980s. Everybody understands the heroin epidemic that was occurring in the 70s with the Vietnam War going on. However, at the height of the crack epidemic in the 80s, there was only 11,000 annual deaths, which is a quarter of what we currently see. It's estimated that 116 people will lose their life every day from overdoses from opiates. Of those 116 overdose deaths, there's another 35 attached to each overdose that are non-fatal. In a speech this summer, Attorney General Jeff Sessions described the opiate epidemic as indeed the deadliest in American history, stating it's public health enemy number one. As you can see here, in the 70s was the height of the heroin crisis in Vietnam, and in the 80s was the height of the crack epidemic. However, in the late 90s and early 2000s was when we began to see the death rate truly rise from prescription opiates. So what is the economic impact of all of this crisis? Well, opiate use and death leads to deaths, lost productivity of the workforce, the cost of treating those afflicted with addiction, and the cost of law enforcement. All of that adds up to a large amount of money. The Journal of American Medicine estimates that there is a $100 billion annual impact from the opiate crisis. The report estimates that $43 billion of that was due to the decrease in workplace productivity resulting from overdose deaths. Another $12 billion came from lost productivity from people who were still alive but continuing to use the opiates. And the final $21 billion came from providing health care and treatment to those dealing with abuse. Of the $21 billion spent to provide treatment for addicts, almost $9 billion of that was doled out by Medicaid, which costs your tax dollars. So exactly who is affected by the opiate crisis? Well, historically, opiate users have been predominantly white, middle-class, male individuals. However, addiction rates are rising in minority communities, and African Americans see a higher addiction rate than Caucasians do. The amount of African Americans to overdose and die in 2014 or in 2016 is that of the 2014 Caucasian levels. The reason why whites were so afflicted by overdose deaths compared to African American and other minority groups is because of insurance coverage and the availability of the products, and the fact that doctors were hesitant to prescribe these narcotic medications to minority groups, believing them to be more susceptible to addiction. So there's been several key components of the opiate crisis that have led us to where we're at from a historical standpoint. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act was passed, which prohibited prescription of opiate narcotics. Before that, doctors were allowed to prescribe heroin, morphine, and other substances similar over the counter. In 1971, we saw the passing of the Controlled Substances Act, which lumped substances in the schedules from 1 to 5 based upon their potential for abuse and their potential for medical benefits. Currently, most prescription opiates fall under the Schedule II class, meaning they have a high potential for abuse, but there is also a realized medical benefit of using them. In the 1980s, we began to see the more war on drugs that we currently experience in this country. The war on drugs took us away from treating drug addiction as a public health crisis and more of a law enforcement issue. So how did we get to this spot with 42,000 people dying every year? Well, the pharmaceutical industries, realizing that the drugs that they were producing were a gold mine, began to use lobbying tactics to influence lawmakers in Washington, D.C. and around state legislators. Currently, drug companies will spend more on lobbying than any other industry combined, which, when you consider all the stuff that's made in the news right now about gun rights and gun lobbying and the NRA, is a big deal. Currently, there's 2 lobbyists from the pharmaceutical industry for every state and local or federal legislator. In the fall of 2017, President Trump nominated Representative Thomas Marino from Pennsylvania to the position of drug czar, the official tasked with leading the war on drugs and helping those struggling with addiction. However, a report surfaced that Representative Marino had accepted money from the lobbyists in the pharmaceutical industry to fund his re-election campaign, and once this was made public, controversy rose to the point where Representative Marino had to withdraw his nomination. Over the past 10 years, $2.5 billion has been spent lobbying legislatures from the pharmaceutical industry alone. This has led to the passing of such acts as the Modernization Act of 2003. The Modernization Act of 2003 was President Bush's shining achievement in healthcare reform. It led to less competition for pharmaceutical workers or pharmaceutical distributors, created Medicare Part D, which covered prescription benefits, and also led to e-prescribing, which meant you no longer had to go straight into a doctor's office to get a prescription refilled. As you can see in my slide here, in 2003, when the Modernization Act was passed, it created Medicare Part D, which handled prescription drug benefits. If you remember, I was talking about how $8.7 billion was shelled out from Medicaid to fund prescription drugs. Well, you see that red line there, and you see how the profit margins for the drug companies skyrocketed after Medicare Part D was enacted. This was all a result of the lobbying done by the drug companies to get these bills passed in their favor. So what responsibility does the government play in this crisis? Well, of course, the aforementioned Modernization Act is one of them. However, all substances coming onto the market have to meet FDA approval. The head of the FDA's approval division, Dr. Robert Rappaport, has stated in the past, in 2013, many patients in the United States suffer from an untreated or poorly treated chronic pain. Further limited access to potential treatments is not the answer when new treatments are critically needed. The pharmaceutical industry, aside from lobbying tactics, has also marketed their product. They have produced misinformation stating to doctors and government officials that there exists a less than 1% chance for abuse. If you recall me talking earlier about the Controlled Substance Act, opiates are classified under Schedule II, which inherently means that there is a high potential for abuse. These drug companies distributed training videos to thousands of prescribing doctors extolling the values of opiates and explaining why they should be prescribed more, all in an effort to increase their bottom line. Currently, drug companies spend 17 times more money on marketing than research and development, and most new drugs entering the market come about as a result from research laboratories and universities. In a 2007 Senate hearing, senators found that the drug companies purposely misled regulators, doctors, and patients about the enormous addiction and abuse potential of OxyContin. There was also one other reason why the opiate epidemic exploded as it has. The Joint Commission for, I'm not sure what that stands for, I have it here in front of me, but I don't want to look for it. Call it JCAHO. So in 2001, JCAHO reintroduced new standards that listed pain as a fifth vital sign. Now, when you go to the doctor's office, you are familiar with pulse, blood pressure, heart rate, and oxygen level as the 4 vital signs. However, with the advent of the fifth vital sign, which is purely subjective to the individual, we're able to use that to prescribe more and more opiates. When you go to the doctor's office, they ask you to describe your pain on a scale of 1 to 10. This is a result of that. And more people describing their pain at a 7 or an 8 led to more and more opiates being prescribed, all because the doctors were misinformed about the virtues of these products that they were prescribing. So in this graph here, you can see what happened, or how much the drug companies have spent on OxyContin compared to other similar narcotics in earlier years. By far and away, the amount spent to market OxyContin has been astronomical. In the 6th year in which it was out on the market, 2002 rather, Purdue Pharmaceuticals spent $30 million to market their product to the consumer. So with as much opiates on the market as there are today, are they effective? Studies have shown that the same amount of Americans are dealing with pain in 2010 as they are in 1990, before the rise of opiate painkillers, which calls into question whether or not they are effective. Science has shown that there's no long-term benefits in reducing chronic pain from opiate usage, and it does not treat the physical condition, but rather masks the emotional distress attached to the pain. So in a word, no, they are not effective, but they continue to be dispersed because of marketing and lobbying by the pharmaceutical industry. So doctors have been advised to prescribe these opiates when over-the-counter medications such as acetaminophen and ibuprofen would suffice for the pain that the individual is dealing with. In the early 2000s, late 2007 to 2010, we saw the rise of what was called doctor shopping and pill mills. Doctor shopping was when individuals would go to unscrupulous doctors and complain about pain, and since there is no clear-cut objective way to quantify this pain, doctors would have to take them at their words. So individuals would be receiving prescriptions for opiates from 3 different doctors, and the doctors had no way of knowing who was prescribing what and how much. We would also see pain clinics in which people would go to these so-called drive-thrus, complain of pain to these unscrupulous doctors who were receiving cash payments, and then take those medications and distribute them on the street, thus flooding the market even further. Here you can see the amount of opiate users in 1999 per population. Give you a second to take that in. This is 10 years later, which is astounding based upon where we were and where we're at currently. So with all that being said, I hope you guys ask me questions, as it's been a very tough assignment for me, but I'm really passionate about this topic in particular. So if anybody does have any questions for me, please ask, and I will provide references and more clear-cut data to back up my facts. Thank you all, and I wish you the best of luck.